Metro 2033, Dmitry Glukhovsky, Chapter 12, Polis. Only one tunnel remained. Only one tunnel, and the goal given to him by Hunter, towards which Artyom stubbornly and recklessly went, would be reached. There were 2, maybe 3 kilometers left to go along a dry and quiet section, and he'd be there. An echoing silence prevailed in Artyom's head, a silence almost like that in the tunnel, but he no longer asked questions of himself. In another 40 minutes, he'd be there. 40 minutes and his trek would be over. He wasn't even aware that he was walking in impenetrable darkness. His legs continued to steadily mark off the ties. It was as if he had forgotten about all the dangers that threatened him, that he was unarmed, and that he had no identity papers, no flashlight, and no weapons, that he was dressed in an odd-looking set of loose overalls, and that, finally, he knew nothing about either this tunnel or the dangers that lay in wait for travelers through it. His conviction that nothing posed a threat to him as long as he was following his path filled him. Where had the seemingly inescapable fear of the tunnels gone? What had happened to his fatigue and lack of faith? The echo spoiled everything. Because this tunnel was so empty, the sound of his steps carried both ahead and behind. Reflected from the walls, they rumbled and gradually receded and passed into a rustle, and then echoed shortly after, so that it seemed Artyom was not walking in the tunnel alone. After some time, this perception becomes so acute that Artyom wanted to stop and listen and find out if the echo of his steps had a life of its own. He continued to struggle with temptation for several minutes. His pace became slower and quieter, and he listened to hear if this affected the loudness of the echo. Finally, Artyom stopped completely. He stood like that in the impenetrable darkness and waited, afraid to take a deep breath, lest the sound of air entering his lungs interfered with the perception of the slightest murmurs in the distance. Silence. Now that he had stopped moving, his perception of the reality of space again vanished. While he was walking, it was as if he was grasping that reality by the soles of his boots. When he stopped in the middle of the ink-black darkness of the tunnel, Artyom suddenly no longer understood where he was. And it seemed to him, when he again began to move, that the barely perceptible echo of his steps reached his ears before his own foot managed to step down onto the concrete floor. His heart began to beat more acutely, but in an instant he was able to convince himself that paying attention to every rustle in the tunnels was silly and served no purpose. For some time, Artyom tried not to listen to the echo at all. Then, when it seemed to him that the most recent of the fading echoes were drawing closer, he covered his ears and continued to move forward. But even this didn't work for long. Removing his palms from his ears after a couple of minutes and continuing to walk, he heard, to his horror, the echo of his steps getting louder in front of him, as if they were approaching. But all he had to do was stop, and so would the sounds in front of him. After a delay of some fraction of a second, this tunnel was testing Artyom and his ability to withstand fear, but he didn't give up. He had already been through much too much to be scared by darkness and an echo. Was it an echo? It was getting closer. There was no doubt about that. Artyom stopped one last time when the phantom steps could be heard about 20 meters ahead of him. This was so inexplicable and weird that he couldn't stand it. He wiped the cold perspiration from his brow and, with his voice cracking, shouted into the emptiness, "Is anyone there?" The echo reverberated frighteningly close, and Artyom didn't recognize his own voice. The rolling echoes chased each other into the depths of the tunnels, shedding syllables. "Anyone there? One there? There?" And nobody answered. And suddenly something incredible happened. They started to come back, repeating his question, the dropped syllables recomposing themselves in reverse order and becoming louder, as though someone about 30 paces away had repeated his question in a frightened voice. Artyom could not endure this. Turning around, he went back, trying not to walk too fast at first, but then he ran, having completely forgotten about not encouraging his fears and stumbling. But after a minute, he understood that the reverberating footsteps continued to be heard at a distance of 20 meters. His invisible pursuer didn't want to let him go. Gasping, Artyom ran without understanding in what direction, and finally collided with a tunnel cross passage. The echo immediately abated. Some time passed before he could gather up his willpower, get up, and take a step forward. It was the right direction. With each passing meter, the sound of steps shuffling against the concrete became closer, moving towards him, and only the blood pounding in his ears slightly suppressed the ominous rustling. Every time Artyom stopped, his pursuer stopped in the darkness as well, for Artyom was now absolutely sure it was no echo. This continued until the steps sounded as close as one's outstretched arm. And then Artyom, yelling and blindly swinging his fists, sprang forward to where he reckoned the source of the steps had to be. His fists made a swishing sound as they cut through the emptiness. Nobody tried to defend themselves against his blows. He flailed the air uselessly, yelling, jumping back, and moving his arms out from his sides in an effort to seize an enemy he could not see in the darkness. Emptiness. There was nobody there. But as soon as he caught his breath and made one more step toward Polis, he heard a heavy shuffling sound right in front of him. He again swung his arm, and again there was nothing. Artyom felt he was losing his mind. Straining his eyes until they hurt, he tried to see anything at all, and his ears tried to catch the nearby breathing of some other creature, but there simply wasn't anybody there. Having stood immobile for several long seconds, Artyom reflected that whatever the explanation might be for this strange phenomenon, it posed no danger to him. Acoustics, more than likely. "When I get home, I'll ask my stepfather," he said to himself, but when he had already brought his foot up to take another step toward his goal, someone quietly whispered directly in his ear, "Wait, you can't go there now." "Who's that? Who's here?" yelled Artyom, breathing heavily, but nobody answered. He was again surrounded by a deep emptiness. Then, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, he hurried off in the direction of Borovitskaya. The phantom steps of his pursuer matched his pace as he moved in the opposite direction, gradually fading in the distance until they fell silent. And only then did Artyom stop. He did not and could not know what it had been. He had never heard of anything like it from any of his friends, nor had his stepfather spoken to him of it at night by the fire. But whoever it was who whispered in his ear and ordered him to stop and wait now, when Artyom no longer feared him, when he had the time to understand what had happened and do some hard thinking about it, it sounded hypothetically convincing. He spent the next 20 minutes sitting on the rails, swaying from side to side as if drunk, fighting the shakes and recalling the strange voice, which belonged to no human, that ordered him to wait. He moved forward only when the shivering finally began to pass, and the frightful whisper in his head had begun to merge with the quiet rush of the growing air current in the tunnel. From that point on, he simply walked forward, trying not to think of anything, stumbling at times over cables lying on the floor, but nothing more terrible happened to him. It seemed to him that not much time had passed, although he couldn't say how much because the minutes all ran together in the darkness, and then he saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Borovitskaya, Polis. Then and there, a rude cry was heard from the station, followed by the sound of shots, and Artyom, springing back, hid in a depression in the wall. From a distance, he heard the lingering cries of the wounded, followed by foul language. And then there was the sound of another burst of automatic fire, amplified by the tunnel. Wait. Artyom ventured to emerge from his hiding place only a full 15 minutes after everything had quietened down. Raising his arms, he walked slowly toward the light. This actually was an entry onto the platform. There was no watch on duty at Borovitskaya, apparently relying on the inviolability of Polis. An access point made of concrete blocks stood 5 meters short of the point where the circular arches of the tunnel ended. A prone body lay next to it in a pool of blood. When Artyom emerged into the field of view of border guards wearing green uniforms and service caps, they ordered him to come closer and stand facing the wall. Seeing the body on the ground, he obeyed immediately. He was quickly searched, asked for his passport, had his arms twisted behind his back, and finally led to the station. Light, the very same. They told the truth. They always told the truth. Legends didn't lie. The light was so bright, Artyom had to squint so as not to be blinded, but the light entered his pupils even through his eyelids, blinding him until it hurt. And only when the border guards blindfolded him did his eyes stop stinging. Returning to the life lived by previous generations of people turned out to be more painful than Artyom could imagine. The rag was removed from his eyes only at the guard shack, which looked like all others, a small office with walls of cracked tile. It was dark here. Only a candle flickered in an aluminium bowl that lay on an ochre-colored wooden table. The guard commander was a heavy-set, unshaven man in a green military shirt with rolled-up sleeves. He was wearing a tie on an elastic band. Collecting some of the liquid wax on his finger and observing how it cooled, he watched Artyom for a long time before asking, "Where are you from? Where's your passport? What's with your eye?" Artyom decided it didn't make sense to be devious, so he told the truth, that the passport had been left with the fascists, and that his eye had also almost remained there. The commander received this information with unexpected benevolence. "Yeah, we know. That tunnel opposite comes out precisely at Chekhovskaya. We've got a whole fortress built there. There's no fighting for now, but some good folks tell us to keep our ears open. Like they say, si vis pacem, para bellum." And he gave Artyom a wink. Artyom didn't understand the last part of what had been said, but preferred not to ask about it. His attention was attracted by the tattoo at the crook of the commander's elbow. It depicted a radiation-deformed bird with 2 heads, spread wings, and hooked talons. It dimly reminded him of something, but of what, he had no idea. Later, when the commander turned to one of the soldiers, Artyom saw that the same image, smaller, had been tattooed on the commander's left temple. "And why'd you come here?" continued the commander. "I'm looking for someone. His name is Melnik. It's probably a nickname. I have an important message for him." The expression on the face of the commander changed immediately. The idly benevolent smile left his lips, and his eyes sparkled with surprise in the light of the candle. "You can deliver it to me." Artyom shook his head and, apologizing, started to explain that there was no way he could do that. That it was hush-hush, you understand? And that he had been strictly ordered to say nothing to anyone except this very same Melnik. The commander studied him one more time and signaled one of the soldiers, who handed him a black plastic telephone handset, together with a neatly coiled, rubber-coated telephone cord of the required length. After dialing a number, the border guard spoke into the receiver. "This is Post Bor South, Ivashov. Get me Colonel Melnik." While he waited for an answer, Artyom managed to notice that both of the other soldiers in the room also had the bird tattoo on their temples. "Who should I say is asking?" asked the commander of Artyom, pressing the side of the handset to his chest. "Say it's from Hunter. An urgent message." The commander nodded and exchanged another couple of phrases with whoever was at the other end of the connection, then concluded the call. "Be at Arbatskia tomorrow morning at 9 at the station manager's office. You're free until then?" He signaled the soldier standing in the doorway, who immediately moved aside, and then turned to Artyom and added, "Wait a second. It would seem you are an honorary first-time guest of ours. So here, hang on to these, but don't forget to give them back." He offered Artyom a pair of dark glasses in a shabby metal frame. "Not until tomorrow?" Artyom was overcome by burning disappointment and resentment. This was why he came here, risking his own life and that of others. This was why he pressed on, forcing himself to move his feet even when he had no strength left at all. And wasn't this an urgent business, to report everything he knew to this so-and-so Melnik, who it turned out couldn't even find a spare minute for him? Or was it rather that Artyom was simply late and Melnik already knew everything? Or maybe Melnik already knows something that Artyom himself hasn't a clue about. Maybe he's so late that his entire mission no longer matters. "Not until tomorrow," he burst out. "The colonel's on a mission today. He'll be back early in the morning," explained Ivashov. "Get going and you'll get some rest besides," he said, and saw Artyom out of the guard shack. Having calmed down, but still nursing a grievance, Artyom put on the glasses and thought they looked good, and they hid the shiner under his eye. The lenses were scratched, and moreover, they distorted objects in the distance. But when he went out onto the platform after having thanked the border guards, he understood that he could not manage without them. The light from the mercury lamps was too bright for him. Besides, it wasn't just Artyom who couldn't open his eyes here. Many at the station hid their eyes behind dark glasses. They're probably also strangers, he thought. It was strange for him to see a fully illuminated metro station. There were absolutely no shadows here. At VDNKH, as well as at all the other stations and substations where he had been up to now, there were few light sources, and they could not illuminate the entire space of what could be seen, and they only shed light on parts of it. There always remained places where not a single beam penetrated. Every person cast several shadows, one from a candle, withered and emaciated, a second from the emergency light, and a third, black and sharply defined, from an electric lantern. They mixed and covered each other and the shadows of others, sometimes coursing for several meters along the floor, startling you, deceiving you, and forcing you to guess and assume. Yet in Polis, every last shadow was eradicated in the ruthless glow of the daylight lamps. Artyom froze in his tracks, looking at Borovitskaya with delight. It remained in surprisingly good condition. Not a trace of soot was evident on the marble walls or white ceiling, and the station was tidy. A woman in light blue overalls labored over a time-blackened bronze panel at the end of the station, industriously scraping the bas relief with a sponge and cleaning solution. The living accommodation here was arranged in the arches. Only 2 arches were left open at each end to access the tracks. The rest, bricked in from both sides, had been turned into real apartments. There was a doorway in each, and some even had wooden doors and glazed windows. The sound of music carried from one of them. Mats lay in front of several doors so that those entering could wipe their feet. This was the first time Artyom has seen anything of the kind. These quarters looked so cozy, so calm, that he felt a tightening in his chest, and a picture from his childhood suddenly appeared before his eyes. But what was most surprising was the chain of bookshelves that stretched along both walls the length of the entire station. They occupied the space between apartments, and this gave the entire station a kind of marvelous, strange look, reminding Artyom of descriptions he'd read of medieval libraries in a book by Borges. The escalators were at the far end of the hall, where the passage to the Arbatskaya station was located. The pressure doors remained open, but a small post was located at the passage. Then again, the guards let anyone who wanted to pass unhindered in both directions, without even checking documents. At the opposite end of the platform, on the other hand, next to the bronze bas relief, there was a real military camp. Several green military tents were set up there, with markings drawn on them like the ones tattooed on the temples of the border guards. In the same place was a cart with some unknown weapon mounted on it, revealed by the long barrel with flared muzzle sticking out from under a cover. Nearby, 2 soldiers in dark green uniforms, helmets, and body armor were on duty. The camp encircled a passage stairway that ascended over the tracks. Flashing arrows indicated this was an exit to the city, whereupon the established precautions became clear to Artyom. A second stairway led to the same place, and was completely blocked off by a wall of huge cement blocks. People dressed in long gray robes made of dense cloth sat at stout wooden tables that stood in the middle of the station. Drawing nearer to them, Artyom was surprised to see their temples were tattooed as well, but not with the image of a bird, but with that of an open book on a background of several vertical lines that bore a resemblance to a colonnade. Catching Artyom's intent look, one of the men seated at the table smiled amiably and asked, "Are you a newcomer? Is this your first time here?" Artyom flinched at the word newcomer, but pulled himself together and nodded. The man who had spoken was not much older than Artyom, and when he rose to shake Artyom's hand, working the flat of his hand out from the broad sleeve of the robe, it turned out they were of about the same height, only the man's physique was more delicate. Artyom's new acquaintance was called Daniel. He was in no hurry to talk about himself, and it was evident that he had decided to talk to Artyom because he was curious about what went on beyond the limits of Polis, about what was new on the ring, and about any news of the fascists and the Reds. In half an hour, they were seated in the spindly Daniel's home, in one of the apartments nestled between arches, and were drinking hot tea, certainly brought here by devious routes from VDNKH. Of the furniture in the room, there was a table piled with books, Tall iron shelves that reached to the ceiling, also crammed to the top with thick volumes and a bed. A weak electric bulb dangled from the ceiling on a wire, illuminating a skillfully executed drawing of an enormous ancient temple that Artyom did not immediately recognize as the library erected on the surface somewhere above Polis. After his host had run out of questions, it was Artyom's turn. "Why do people here have tattoos on their heads?" he asked. "What, don't you know anything about castes?" said Daniel, surprised. "And you've never heard of Polis Council?" Artyom suddenly remembered that someone... No, how could he forget? It was that old man, Mikhail Porfiryevich, who had been killed by the fascists, had told him that power in Polis was divided between the soldiers and the librarians because formerly the buildings of the library and some organization related to the army had stood on the surface. "I've heard of it," he nodded. The warriors and librarians. "So then, you're a librarian?" Daniel shot him a frightened glance, paled, and began to cough. After a while, he pulled himself together and calmly said, "What do you mean, librarian? Have you so much as seen a living librarian? I wouldn't recommend it. Librarians sit up above. You've seen our fortifications down here. Heaven forbid they come down. Don't ever confuse these things. I am not a librarian. I am a guardian. We are also called Brahmins." "What kind of strange name is that?" asked Artyom, raising his eyebrows. "You see, we have something of a caste system here, like in old India. A caste, well, it's like a class. Didn't the Reds explain that to you? Never mind. There's a caste of priests, or guardians of knowledge, those who collect books and work with them," he explained, while Artyom continued to marvel at how painstakingly he avoided the word librarian. "And there's a warrior caste of those who protect and defend. It's very similar to India, where there was also a caste of merchants and a caste of servants. We have all that too, and we also use the Hindu names for them among ourselves. The priests are the Brahmins, the soldiers are the Kshatriyas, the merchants are the Vaishyas, and the servants are the Shudras. People become members of a caste once and for the rest of their lives. There are special rites of passage, especially for Kshatriyas and Brahmins. In India, it was a tribal matter, ancestral, but with us, it's something you choose yourself when you turn 18. Here at Borovitskaya, there are more Brahmins. In fact, almost everyone is a Brahmin. Our school is here, our libraries and cells. There are special conditions at the library because the Red Line crosses there, and it must be protected, and before the war, there were more of us there. Now they've moved to Alexandrovsky, Sad. Meanwhile, at Arbatskia, it's nearly all Kshatriyas because of the general staff." Hearing yet another hissed ancient Indian word, Artyom sighed heavily. It was unlikely he'd remember all these difficult titles right off. However, Daniel did not pay attention to this and continued his narrative. "Obviously, only two castes enter into the council, ours and the Kshatriyas, though as a matter of fact, we just call them war doggies," he said to Artyom with a wink. "So why do they tattoo two-headed birds on themselves?" asked Artyom. "You at least have books, that makes sense. But birds, that's their totem," said Brahmin Daniel and shrugged. "I think that formerly it was a guardian spirit of the radiological defense forces. An eagle, I believe. After all, they believe in some strange thing of their own. Generally speaking, the castes around here don't get along particularly well. There was a time they even feuded." Through the blinds, they could see that the station lights had been dimmed. Local night was falling. Artyom started to gather his things. "Is there a hotel here where I can spend the night? Because I have a meeting tomorrow at 9 at Arbatskaya, and I have nowhere to stay." "If you want, stay here," said Daniel, shrugging. "I'll sleep on the floor. I'm used to it. I was just about to prepare dinner. Stay, and you'll tell me what else you've seen along the road, because... you know, I don't ever get away from this place. The guardian vows do not allow us to travel further than one station." After thinking about it, Artyom nodded. It was comfortable and warm in the room, and Artyom had taken a liking to his host from the very beginning. They had something in common. In 15 minutes, He was already cleaning mushrooms, while Daniel was cutting salt pork into small slices. "Have you ever seen the library even once with your own eyes?" asked Artyom, his mouth full. They were eating stewed pork with mushrooms from aluminium mess dishes. "You mean the Great Library?" asked the Brahmin dourly. "I mean the one up there." "It's still there, right?" said Artyom, pointing his fork at the ceiling. "Only our elders go up into the Great Library, and the stalkers, too, who work for the Brahmins," answered Daniel. "So they're the ones who bring books down from above? From the library? I mean from the Great Library," Artyom said, hurriedly correcting himself as he saw his host scowl once more. "They do, but only by order of the caste elders. It is not within our power to do so ourselves, so we must use mercenaries," the Brahmin explained grudgingly. "According to the Testament, we should have been doing that, preserving knowledge and imparting it to seekers. But in order for knowledge to be imparted, it must first be obtained. Yet who among us will dare to go in there?" he said, lifting his eyes upward with a sigh. "Because of the radiation," said Artyom, comprehending. "That too. But mainly because of the librarians," said Daniel in a subdued voice. "But aren't you the librarians, or at least the descendants of the librarians? That's what I've heard. You know, let's not talk about this at the table. In fact, let someone else explain it to you. I don't like to talk about this subject, really." Daniel started to clear the table and then, after thinking for a moment, moved some books from a shelf off to the side, revealing a gap between the volumes standing in the back row, in which a round-bellied bottle of moonshine gleamed. Table glasses were found among the dishware. After some time, Artyom, who had been examining the shelves with delight, decided to break the silence. "Wow, you sure do have a lot of books," he said. "Over where we are, at VD and KH, I don't think you could collect as many in the whole library. I finished reading them all a long time ago. It's rare that something good shows up. Only my stepfather brings anything worth reading, and the itinerant merchants bring nothing but miscellaneous rubbish in their suitcases, all sorts of detective novels. Half the time, you can't tell what's going on in them anyway. That was another reason I dreamed of entering Polis, because of the Great Library. I just can't imagine how many there must be up there if they built such a huge place to keep them." And he nodded towards the drawing over the table. The eyes of both of them were shining already. Daniel, flattered by Artyom's words, leaned over the table and said with great gravity, "They don't mean a thing, all those books. And the Great Library was not built for them. And it's not books that are stored there." Artyom looked at him with surprise. The Brahmin opened his mouth to continue, but suddenly rose from his chair, went to the door, cracked it open, and listened. Then he quietly closed the door, sat back down, and whispered the rest of what he wanted to say. The entire Great Library was built for the one and only book. And it alone is hidden there. The rest are needed to help hide it. In reality, it is this book that is being sought. And it is being guarded, he added, and squirmed. "What kind of book is it?" asked Artyom, also lowering his voice. "An ancient folio, a book of pages, black as anthracite, where all of history is recorded in gold letters. To the end." "So why are people searching for it?" whispered Artyom. "You really don't understand," said the Brahmin with a shake of his head. "To the end means to the very end, and there's still some way to go before then, I saw. So whoever has this knowledge..." A translucent shadow flashed behind the blinds, and Artyom, even though he was looking Daniel in the eye, noticed it and gave him a sign. Interrupting his tale in mid-sentence, Daniel jumped from his seat and darted to the door. Artyom bolted after him. There was nobody on the platform, but retreating footsteps could be heard from the direction of the passage. The sentries slept peacefully on chairs on both sides of the escalator. When they returned to the room, Artyom waited for the Brahmin to continue his story, but the latter had sobered up and only glumly shook his head. "We're forbidden to relate this," he snapped. "That part of the testament is only for the initiated." "The alcohol loosened my tongue," he said, wincing fretfully. "Don't even think of telling anyone what you heard. If it gets out to anyone that you know about the book, then there'll be no end of trouble for you. And for me, too." And then Artyom suddenly understood why his palms had started sweating when the Brahmin had told him about the book. He remembered. But aren't there several of these books? He asked, his heart coming to a standstill. Daniel cautiously looked him in the eyes. What do you mean? Fear the truths hidden in ancient folios, in which the words are lettered in gold and the viper-black paper does not rot, he recited, while Bourbon's expressionless face loomed in a foggy haze before his eyes, mechanically uttering alien and incomprehensible words. The Brahmin stared at him fixedly in amazement. How do you know that? A revelation. There's not just one book. What's in the others? Asked Artyom, looking at the drawing of the library as if under a spell. Only one is left. There were 3 folios, said Daniel, surrendering finally. The past, the present, and the future. The past and the present disappeared irrevocably centuries ago. Only the last and most important one remains. And where is it? Lost somewhere in the main stack archives. There are more than 40 million volumes there. One of them, a completely ordinary book by all appearances in a standard binding, is it. To recognize it, you have to open the book and skim through it. According to legend, the pages of the folio actually are black. But you'd have to spend 70 years of your life without sleep or rest to skim through all the books in the main stack archive. Yet people can't stay there for more than a day. And second, nobody will let you stand around quietly and look through all the books that are stored there. And that's enough about that. He laid some bedding on the floor, lit a candle on the table, and turned off the light. Artyom lay down unwillingly. For some reason, he didn't want to sleep at all, although he could not remember the last time that he managed to get some rest. I wonder, can you see the Kremlin when you go up to the library? He asked the emptiness, because Daniel had begun to fall asleep. Of course you can see it, only you can't look at it. It draws you in, he muttered. What do you mean, it draws you in? Daniel lifted himself onto his elbows, and his face, knitted in displeasure, was illuminated by the yellow spot of light. The stalkers say that you can't look at the Kremlin when you go out, especially not at the stars on the towers. As soon as you look, you can't tear your eyes away. And if your gaze lingers for a while, the Kremlin starts to draw you inside. There is a reason all the gates stand wide open. That's why stalkers never go up into the great library by themselves. If one happens to glance at the Kremlin, the other will snap him out of it immediately. What's inside the Kremlin? Whispered Artyom, swallowing hard. Nobody knows, because nobody who's ever gone in has ever come out again. Up there on the shelf, if you like, there's a book with an interesting history of stars and swastikas, including the ones on the Kremlin towers. He got up, groped the book from the shelf, opened it to the correct page, and got back under his blanket. Daniel was asleep within a couple of minutes, but Artyom moved the candle closer and started to read. Being the smallest and least influential of political groups that fought for influence and power in Russia after the First Revolution, the Bolsheviks were not considered serious competitors by any of the opposing sides. They enjoyed no support from the peasantry and relied only on a small number of supporters among the working class and in the Navy. Zevs Lenin, who studied alchemy and the invocation of spirits in secret Swiss schools, was able to find his principal allies on the other side of the barrier between worlds. It is precisely in this period that the pentagram emerges for the first time as the symbol of the communist movement within the Red Army. As is known, the pentagram is the most widespread and accessible portal between worlds for novices, allowing demons to enter our reality. At the same time, if the creator of a pentagram uses it skillfully, he can control the demons summoned into our world, and they must obey him. Normally, in order to better control a summoned creature, a protective perimeter is drawn around the pentagram, preventing the demon from escaping beyond the ring. It is not known how, exactly, the leaders of the communist movement were able to achieve that which the most powerful black magicians of all ages had sought, establishing links to the demon lords who commanded the obedience of hordes of their lesser brethren. Experts are convinced that the lords themselves, sensing the forthcoming war and the most horrible bloodshed ever in the history of mankind, drew nearer to the boundary between worlds and summoned those who could permit them to collect a harvest of human lives. In exchange, they promised support and protection. The story of how the Bolshevik leadership was funded by German intelligence is true, to be sure, but it would be foolish and superficial to believe that it was only thanks to his foreign partners that Sixth Lenin and his comrades in arms were able to tip the scales in their favor. Even then, the future communist leader had protectors who were immeasurably more powerful and wiser than the military intelligence officials in the Kaiser's Germany. Naturally, the details of the secret compact with the powers of darkness are not accessible to modern researchers. However, their result is clear. After a short time, pentagrams appear on banners, on the headgear of Red Army soldiers, and on the armor of its still sparse military equipment. Each of them opened a gate into our world to a demon protector who guarded the wearer of the pentagram from external violence. The demons received their pay, as usual, in blood. In the 20th century alone, according to the most conservative estimates, around 30 million inhabitants of the country were sacrificed. The compact with the lords of the summoned powers quickly justified itself. The Bolsheviks seized and consolidated power, and although Lenin himself, who had been the intermediary between the two worlds, could not endure and died only 54 years after his birth, eaten from within by the fires of hell, his followers unhesitatingly continued his work. Soon after followed the demonization of the entire country. School children pinned their first pentagram to their chests. Few know that from the outset the ritual of initiation into the little octobrists intended the badge's pin to be used to pierce the child's skin. The demon of the little octobrist star would thus taste the blood of its future host, entering into a sacral union with its host once and forever. Growing up and becoming a pioneer, the child would receive a new pentagram, and a part of the essence of the compact would be revealed to those experiencing insight. A gold imprinted portrait of the leader was wrapped in flames, in which he disappeared. Thus the rising generation was reminded of the heroic deed of self-sacrifice. After that was the Komsomol, and finally the way was cleared for the chosen to enter into the priestly caste, the Communist Party. Myriads of summoned spirits protected everyone and everything in the Soviet state. Children and adults, buildings and equipment, while the demon lords themselves took up residence in the giant ruby pentagrams on the Kremlin towers, willingly agreeing to confinement for the sake of their increased power. It was precisely from here that invisible lines of force spread over the entire country, holding it back from chaos and collapse, and subordinating its inhabitants to the will of those who occupied the Kremlin. In some sense, the entire Soviet Union was turned into one giant pentagram whose surrounding protective perimeter became its national boundary. Artyom tore himself away from the page and looked around. The candle had burned down and had started to smoke. Daniel was sound asleep, with his face turned to the wall. Artyom stretched and then returned to the book. Why? The supreme test for Soviet power became the clash with National Socialist Germany. Protected by powers no less ancient or powerful than was the Soviet Union, the armor-fettered Teutons were able to penetrate deeply into our country for the second time in 1,000 years. This time, their banners were inscribed with a reversed symbol of the sun, light and prosperity. To this very day, 50 years after the victory, tanks with pentagrams on their turrets continue in perpetual battle against tanks whose steel bears the swastika in museum panoramas, on television screens, on sheets of graph paper torn out of school notebooks. The candle flickered one last time and went out. It was time to go to sleep. If you turned your back to the monument, you could see a small section of the high wall and the silhouettes of the sharp-pointed towers in the gap between the half-ruined houses. But as had been explained to Artyom, you couldn't turn around and look at them, and it was also forbidden to leave the doors with the steps unattended, because if something were to happen, you'd have to sound the alarm, but if you so much as peeked, that's it. You're done for, and the others suffer too. Consequently, Artyom stood still, although the desire to turn around kept eating at him. Meanwhile, he examined the monument, whose bottom had been overgrown with moss. The monument depicted a gloomy old man sitting in a capacious armchair and leaning on an elbow. Something dripped slowly and thickly from his pitted bronze pupils onto his chest, giving the impression that the monument was crying. It was unbearable to look at this for very long. So Artyom went around the statue and attentively looked at the doors. Everything was tranquil. There was complete silence, and there was just the slightest sound of the wind rambling between the picked-over carcasses of buildings. The detachment had departed some time ago, but had not taken Artyom along. They ordered him to stay and stand guard, and if anything happened, to go down into the station and give warning of what happened. Time passed slowly, and he measured it with steps which he took around the bottom of the monument. 1, 2, 3... It happened when he got to 500. A clatter and growling broke out to his rear, behind his back, where he could not look. Something was nearby, and it could rush at Artyom at any moment. He froze, straining his ears, then dropped to the ground and pressed himself against the base of the statue, holding his weapon ready. Now it was close at hand, apparently on the other side of the monument. Artyom distinctly heard its husky animal breathing. Moving around the side of the statue's base, he gradually moved closer to the sound. He tried to stop his hands from shaking and to keep his sight on the place where the creature would appear. But the breathing and the sound of steps suddenly began to retreat. But when Artyom looked out from behind the statue to take advantage of the opportunity to fire a burst into the back of his unknown enemy, he immediately forgot about both his enemy and everything else. The star on the Kremlin tower was clearly visible even from here. The tower itself remained only a vague silhouette in the unsteady light of a partially cloud-covered moon. But the star stood out clearly against the sky, riveting the attention of any who looked at it for a completely understandable reason. It glittered. Not believing his eyes, he took out his field binoculars. The star burned a fierce, bright red color, illuminating several meters of the space around it. And when Artyom looked closer, he noticed that its fire was irregular. It was as if a tempest was confined inside the giant ruby. It brightened in fits and starts as if something inside was flowing, seething, flaring. The sight was of fantastic beauty, not possible in this world, but it was poorly visible from such a distance. He had to get closer. Shouldering his weapon, Artyom ran down the stairs, jumped over the cracked asphalt in the street, and stopped at the only corner from where he could see the whole Kremlin wall. And the towers. A red star beamed from each one of them. Hardly catching his breath, Artyom again looked through the eyepieces. The stars flared with the same seething, irregular glow, and he wanted to look at them forever. Concentrating on the closest of them, Artyom still admired its fantastic flows, until he suddenly seemed to feel as if he could distinguish the shape of whatever was moving inside under the crystal surface. To better make out the strange outlines, he had to get a little closer. Having forgotten about all dangers, he stopped in the middle of the open space, and now kept his binoculars glued to his eyes, trying to understand what he had managed to see. The demon lords, he remembered at last. The marshals of an army of unclean spirits that had been summoned to defend the Soviet state. The country and the whole world as well had fallen to pieces, but the pentagrams on the Kremlin towers had remained untouched. The governors who had entered into a compact with the demons were long dead, and there was nobody left to free them. Nobody? What about him? I need to find the gates, he thought. I need to find a way in. Get up. You have to go soon. Daniel shook him. Artyom yawned and rubbed his eyes. He had just dreamed something incredibly interesting, but the dream had faded instantly, and he could not recall what he had seen. All of the lights had already been lit in the station, and he could hear the cleaning women sweeping the platform while merrily bantering. He put on his dark glasses and shuffled off to wash up, having tossed over his shoulder a not very clean towel his host had given him. The toilets were located at the same end as the bronze panel, and the line of people waiting to get in was not short. Having got in line, continuing to yawn, Artyom tried to recall at least some of the images from his dream. The line stopped moving forward for some reason, and the people in it started to murmur loudly. Attempting to understand what was the matter, Artyom looked around. All eyes were fixed on a bolted iron door. It was now open, and a tall man stood in the frame. Seeing him, Artyom, too, forgot why he was standing there. It was a stalker. He had imagined them to look exactly like this, both from his stepfather's stories and the rumors gleaned from itinerant merchants. The stalker wore a stained protective suit, scorched in places, and a long, heavy body armor vest. His shoulders were broad. A light machine gun was casually slung over the right one, while a gleaming, oily belt of ammunition hung like a baldric from the left. He wore rough, laced boots with the pants legs tucked into the top, and there was a large canvas rucksack on his back. The stalker took off his round Special Forces helmet, pulled off the rubber facepiece of his gas mask, and stood there, flushed and wet, talking to the post commander about something. He was no longer young. Artyom saw gray stubble on his cheeks and chin, and silvery strands in his short black hair. Yet the man radiated power and confidence. He was completely at ease and collected, as if, even here, in a quiet and cheerful station, he was ready to meet danger at any moment and not let it catch him unawares. By now, only Artyom continued to unceremoniously examine the arrival. The people behind him in line first tried to urge him forward, and then simply started to walk around him. "Artyom, what's the delay? You'll be late if you don't watch out!" Daniel came up to him. Hearing his name, the stalker turned towards Artyom, looked at him intently, and suddenly took a broad step toward him. "You from VDNK?" he asked in a deep, resonant voice. Artyom nodded silently and felt his knees start to shake. "You the one looking for Melnik?" The stalker continued. Artyom nodded once more. "I'm Melnik. You have something for me?" The stalker looked Artyom in the eye. Artyom hastily groped around his neck for the cord with the cylindrical case that it now felt odd to part with, as if with a talisman, and extended it to the stalker. The stalker pulled off his leather gloves, opened the cover, and carefully shook something out of the capsule into his palm. It was a small scrap of paper, a note. "Come with me. I couldn't not make it yesterday. Sorry." The call came when we were already on our way to the surface. Having said a quick goodbye and thanks to Daniel, Artyom hurried after Melnik up the escalators that led to the passage to Arbatskaya. "Is there any news from Hunter?" he asked awkwardly, barely keeping up with the long-striding stalker. "Haven't heard a thing from him." "I fear you'll have to ask your Dark Ones about him now," said Melnik, looking back over his shoulder at Artyom. "On the other hand, you could say there's too much news from VDNK." Artyom felt his heart start beating more forcefully. "What news?" he asked, trying to suppress his worry. "Oh, not much good," said the stalker dryly. The Dark Ones went on the offensive again. There was a heavy battle a week ago. 5 people were killed, and it seems there are even more Dark Ones there now. People are starting to flee that station of yours. They can't stand the horror, they say. So Hunter was right when he told me something sinister was hidden there. He felt it. "Who died, do you know?" asked Artyom, frightened, trying to recollect who was supposed to stand duty that day a week ago. What day was today? Was it Jenka, Andrei? Please don't let it be Jenka. "I wouldn't know. It's not enough the undead are worming their way in there, but some kind of devilment is coming out of the tunnels around Prospect Mir, too. People lose their memory, and several people died along the tracks. What's to be done? There's a council meeting today. The Brahmin elders and generals will have their say, but I doubt they'll be able to help your station with anything. They barely defend Polis itself, and then only because nobody dares make a serious attempt on it." They came out onto the Arbatskaya station. Mercury lamps burned here, too. And just as at Borovitskaya, the living quarters were located in bricked-in arches. Sentries stood next to several of them, and overall there was an uncommonly large number of soldiers here. The walls, painted white, were hung in places with army parade standards, with embroidered gold eagles that seemed almost untouched by time. There was activity all around. Long-robed Brahmins walked about, while cleaning women washed the floor and scolded those who tried to pass over the still-wet surface. There were quite a number of people here, too, from other stations. They could be identified by their dark glasses, or by the way they folded their hands together to cover their squinting eyes. Only living and administrative quarters were located on the platform. The shopping arcades and the food vendors were removed to the passages. Melnik led Artyom to the end of the platform where the office premises began, seated him on a marble bench lined with wood that had been burnished by contact with thousands of passengers, asked him to wait, and departed. Looking at the intricate stucco work under the ceiling, Artyom thought about how Polis had lived up to his expectations. Life here really was arranged in a completely different way. People weren't as cutthroat, exasperated, or browbeaten as at other stations. Knowledge, books, and culture seemed to play a thoroughly fundamental role. They had passed by at least 5 bookstalls in the passage between Borovitskaya and Arbatskaya. There were even playbills posted announcing the performance of a play by Shakespeare tomorrow night, and just as at Borovitskaya, he could hear music playing somewhere. The passage and both stations had been maintained in excellent condition. Although blotches and seepage were evident on the walls, all damage was immediately patched by repair teams who scurried about everywhere. Out of curiosity, Artyom glanced down the tunnel, where he saw everything was in perfect order. It was dry, clean, and an electric light burned at intervals of 100 meters as far as the eye could see. From time to time, handcars loaded with crates passed by, stopping to discharge the occasional passenger or take on a box of books that Polis sent out through the entire metro. All of this might soon come to an end, thought Artyom suddenly. VDNA can no longer withstand the pressure from these monsters. No wonder, he said to himself, recalling one night on watch, when he had to repel an attack by the Dark Ones, and all of the nightmares that tormented him after that fight. Was it true that VDNK was falling? That meant that he would no longer have a home. He wondered if his friends and stepfather had managed to flee. If so, there was a chance of meeting them one day in the metro. If Melnik told him that he had completed his mission and could do nothing more, then he promised himself he'd head back home. If his station was destined to act as a lone covering force in the path of the Dark Ones, and if his friends and relatives were slated to die defending the station, then he'd rather be with them instead of taking refuge in this paradise. He suddenly had the urge to return home, catch sight of the row of army tents, the tea factory, and chew the fat with Zhenka and tell him of his adventures. It was a sure thing he wouldn't believe half of it, if he were still alive. "Simon, Artyom," Melnik called. "They want to talk to you." He had managed to rid himself of his protective suit and was wearing a turtleneck, a black navy fore and aft cap with no insignia, and pants with pockets, the same as Hunter's. The stalker somehow reminded him of the Hunter, not by his appearance, of course, but by his behavior. He was just as collected and resilient and spoke in the same way, using short, telegraphic sentences. The walls in the offices were lined with stained oak, and 2 large oil paintings hung there opposite each other. Artyom easily recognized the library on one of them, while the other depicted a tall building covered in white stone. The label under the picture read, "General Staff, Russian Federation Ministry of Defense." A large wooden table stood in the middle of the spacious room. About 10 men sat in chairs around the table, studying Artyom. Half of them wore gray Brahmin robes, the other half military officer uniforms. As it turned out, the officers sat under the painting of the General Staff, while the Brahmins sat under the library painting. A person of short stature but of commanding bearing sat solemnly at the head of the table. He wore austere glasses and had a large bald spot. He was dressed in a suit and tie, but had no tattoo to designate membership in any caste. "To business," he began without introducing himself. "Tell us everything you know, including the situation with the tunnels from your station to Prospect Emiar." Artyom proceeded to describe in detail the history of the VDNKH battle against the Dark Ones, then about Hunter's mission, and finally about his trek to Polis. When he related the events in the tunnels between Alexievskaya, Rizhskaya, and Prospect Mir, the soldiers and Brahmins started to whisper among themselves, some incredulous, others animated, while an officer who sat in the corner diligently recording the narrative occasionally asked him to repeat what he had said. When the discussions finally stopped, Artyom was allowed to continue his story. But his recital elicited little interest in his listeners until he got to Polyanka and its inhabitants. "If you will," interrupted one of the officers indignantly. He was about 50 years old, of compact build, with slicked-back hair, and he wore steel-framed glasses that cut into the meaty bridge of his nose. "It is known without a doubt that Polyanka is uninhabited. The station was deserted a long time ago. It's true that dozens of people pass through the station every day, but nobody can live there. Gas erupts there from time to time, and there are signs everywhere warning of the danger. And, well, of course, cats and paper waste are long since gone, too. The platform is completely empty. Completely. Cease your insinuations." The other officers nodded in agreement, and Artyom fell silent, perplexed. When he stopped at Polyanka, the thought entered his mind for an instant that the tranquil conditions that prevailed at the station were unreal for the metro. But he was immediately distracted from such thinking by the inhabitants, who were more than real. The Brahmins, however, did not support the angry outburst. The oldest of them, a bald man with a long gray beard, regarded Artyom with interest and exchanged some words with those sitting nearby in an unintelligible language. "This gas, as you know, has hallucinogenic properties when mixed in certain proportions with air," said the Brahmin sitting at the old man's right hand in a conciliatory manner. "The point is, can we now believe any of the rest of his story?" retorted the officer, frowning at Artyom. "Thank you for your report," said the man in the suit, interrupting the discussion. "The council will discuss it and inform you of the result. You may go." Artyom started to make his way to the exit. Was his entire conversation with the two hookah-smoking inhabitants of Polyanka really just a hallucination? But that would then mean the idea of his having been selected, of his being able to bend reality while fulfilling his destiny, was just a product of his imagination, an attempt at self-consolation. Now even the mysterious encounter in the tunnel between Borovitskaya and Polyanka no longer seemed a miracle to him. Gas? Gas. He sat on the bench next to the door and didn't even pay attention to the distant voices of the arguing council members. People went by, hand cars and rail motor cars drove through the station, and the minutes passed while he sat and thought. Did he actually have a mission, or did he make the whole thing up? What'll he do now? Where will he go? Someone tapped him on the shoulder. It was the officer who made notes during his narrative. "The members of the council state that Polis cannot assist your station in any way. They are grateful for your detailed report on the situation in the subway system. You are free to go." That was it. Polis can't help with anything. It was all for nothing. He had done everything he could, but it changed nothing. All that remained was to return to VDN-Kh and stand shoulder to shoulder with the remaining defenders. Artyom heaved himself up from the bench and went off slowly, with no particular destination in mind. When he had almost reached the passage to Borovitskaya, he heard a quiet cough behind him. Artyom turned and saw the Brahmin from the council, the same one who had sat at the old man's right hand. "Wait a moment, young man. I believe you and I need to discuss something privately," added the Brahmin, smiling politely. "If the council is not in a position to do anything for you, then perhaps your obedient servant can be of more help." He took Artyom by the elbow and led him away to one of the brick residences in the arches. There were no windows here and no electric lights. Only the flame of a small candle lit the faces of several people who had gathered in the room. Artyom was not able to get a good look at them because the Brahmin who brought him quickly blew out the flame and the room was plunged into darkness. "Is it true about Polyanka?" asked a woolly voice. "Yes," answered Artyom unwaveringly. "Do you know what we Brahmins call Polyanka? The station of destiny. Let the Kshatriyas think it's the gas that brings about the gloomy enchantment. We won't protest. We would not restore the sight of our most recent enemy. We believe that people encounter messengers of Providence at this station. Providence has nothing to say to most of them, so they simply pass through an empty, abandoned station. But those who have met someone at Polyanka should have a most attentive attitude towards such an encounter and remember what was said to them there for the rest of their lives. Do you remember?" I've forgotten, lied Artyom, not particularly trusting these people who reminded him of the members of a sect. Our elders are convinced that you have not come here by chance. You are not an ordinary person, and your special abilities, which have saved you several times along the way, can help us too. In exchange, we will extend a helping hand to you and your station. We are the guardians of knowledge, and that includes information that can save Vidienke. What's Vidienka got to do with anything? Burst Artyom. You all talk only about Vidienke. It's as if you don't understand that I came here not just for the sake of my station, and not because of my own misfortune. All of you are in danger. First Vidienke will fall, then the whole line will follow, and then the entire metro will come to an end. There was no response. The silence deepened. Only the cadenced breathing of those present could be heard. Artyom waited a bit longer, and then, unable to stay silent, asked, "What must I do?" "Go up into the great stack archives. Find that which is ours by right, and return it to us here. If you can find what we seek, we will give you the knowledge that will help destroy the threat, and may the great library burn if I lie."